Wayne spent the day putting up missing person posters around his neighborhood. His friend, David Hillegeist, had gone missing on May 29th, and he wanted to assist in his parents' search for their son. His disappearance wasn't the only one. Several youths had gone missing in the Houston Heights neighborhood over the past year, vanishing without a trace nor an explanation. The thought of going missing like the rest of them frightened him. They were all around his age and had similar backgrounds and lives. Elmer Wayne Henley Jr., who goes by his middle name Wayne, was born on May 9, 1956, in Houston, Texas. He was the first child of Elmer Henley Sr. and Mary Henley. 3 more children would be born in the coming years. Elmer, who was 17 at the time of his first son's birth, was an abusive alcoholic. During fits of rage, he would beat Wayne, his siblings, his mother, and his grandmother. On one occasion, he grabbed a pistol and fired it at Wayne, though it was either a blank or the bullet missed. Elmer and Mary divorced in 1970 when Wayne was 14. His mother tried to provide for her 4 children by working as a parking lot attendant, but it wasn't quite enough. Wayne had to help out. He dropped out of school and worked menial jobs to further support the family. Around this time, Wayne started hanging out with someone a year older than him. David Owen Brooks was born on February 12, 1955, in Houston. Like Wayne, his parents were divorced, and like Wayne, he also dropped out of high school. He claimed that people would often mock his appearance, and he did indeed look a bit strange. If you see photos of him, you'll notice his head is just a bit too big for his face, and his hairstyle doesn't really fit on him. Despite these external imperfections, Wayne accepted David, and the two became close friends, often skipping school together before they dropped out. During their friendship, Wayne noticed that David spent an awful lot of time with one particular man who was twice his age. Dean Arnold Corll was born on Christmas Eve, 1939, in Fort Wayne, Indiana. He was the first child of Arnold Edwin Corll and Mary Emma Robinson. His younger brother, Stanley, was born in 1942. Dean's childhood is unremarkable, to say the least. He was a quiet kid who had no history of violence or juvenile delinquency. The only interesting things about it have more to do with the people around him. Arnold Corll often quarreled with his wife, and their bitter marriage ended in 1946. Soon after, Arnold was drafted into the Air Force and was sent to Memphis, Tennessee. Mary moved her 2 kids to a trailer home in Memphis so that her kids could still have a chance to visit their father on occasion. In 1950, after some reconciliation, Arnold remarried Mary, and the family moved to Pasadena, Texas. By 1953, however, the two had divorced again. Not long after, Mary met a man named Jake West, a traveling salesman whom she fell in love with. They married, and the family moved to Vidor, Texas. In August of 1955, Dean's half-sister, Joyce West, was born. Things seemed to be going well for the family, and soon they would begin making a name for themselves in their community. In the mid-50s, someone suggested to the family that they start up a candy business. Mary liked this idea, and the Pecan Prince came to fruition. As the name suggests, the candies, or divinities as they called them, were made out of pecans. The family produced the candies out of their garage, and Jake would sell them on his various business trips. Meanwhile, Dean began attending Vidor High School. He was generally regarded as shy and occupied, though he did begin dating and was active in the school's band. He graduated in 1958, though some sources claim that he actually didn't graduate, as he had failed one of his classes. In any case, the family moved back to the Houston area to expand Pecan Prince by opening a shop in the Houston Heights neighborhood. Dean worked full-time in the family business for a couple more years before he was sent back to Indiana to live on his grandmother's farm. Here, Dean met a young woman, and the two began dating. By 1962, the woman decided that Dean was her true love. In a phone call with him, she proposed to Dean. He hung up the phone and never talked to her again. Shortly after this, Dean moved back to Houston Heights. By this point, cracks were forming in Mary and Jake's marriage, and in 1963, Mary suffered her third divorce. Jake kept a hold of pecan prints, and Mary founded a new business called the Corll Candy Company. Dean was appointed vice president and oversaw the company's operations. The pecan prints and the Corll Candy Company competed with one another over the coming years. The next year, in August of 1964, Dean left the company as he had been drafted into the Army. He reported for duty at Fort Polk, Louisiana. After receiving training, he was sent to Fort Benning, Georgia, for additional training, and later to Fort Hood, Texas. It was during his military service that Dean realized why he refused to enter a long-term relationship with the girl in Indiana.
Oh, nigga, you gay!
Dean grew to despise the military, and in June of 1965, a little under a year after his drafting, Dean was honorably discharged on the grounds that the Corll Candy Company needed him back. So, he resumed his position as vice president and the business would thrive. A few other local teenagers sought employment at the company, and Dean welcomed them with open arms. Across the street from the company's factory was an elementary school. Much of the candy that was produced was given to the school children free of charge. Locals would often refer to Dean as the Candy Man of Houston Heights. This nickname would come to have a very negative connotation. It was through these charitable efforts that Dean met David Brooks, who then was 12 years old. David greatly admired Dean and saw him as a father figure of sorts. Dean was also considered a mentor to his young factory colleagues, and they enjoyed working alongside him. Dean enjoyed the company of youths and teenagers. Maybe a little too much. One teenage colleague in particular remembers an incident while he was at the candy factory. When him and Dean were alone together, Dean would often flirt with him and made increasingly sexual comments. Uncomfortable with these advances, the teenager reported this to Mary. In response, she fired the teenager. Mary refused to believe that Dean was a pedophile, though she and many others had suspicions that he was indeed a bit gay. By 1968, the Corll Candy Company was failing. They were unable to pull in enough revenue to make ends meet. Coworkers often saw Dean digging a giant hole in one room of the factory and filling it with cement. According to Dean, he was doing this to bury candy that wouldn't sell and had gone bad. By June of that year, the Corll Candy Company had officially disbanded. Mary and Joyce moved to Colorado while Dean remained in Houston and found work as an electrician. He remained in contact with local teens, including David, who now was a close friend of his. Dean had a lot of money left over from the candy business, and he would give some to David if he ever asked for it. Left on his own and no longer busy making candy, Dean's urges began to gnaw at him, and he realized David was the perfect person to satisfy them. He began paying David hundreds of dollars in exchange for sexual favors. Dean was 29 and David was 14. The two remained close after the turn of the decade and into 1971. Sometime that year, David introduced Wayne to Dean and the trio began hanging out together. Dean was no longer a pillar of the community. It's very likely that he began suffering from depression as he was now in his 30s and lacked purpose in life. He descended into excess and pederasty. He frequently held parties at his home where he, David, Wayne, and several others would drink beer, smoke marijuana, or huff paint. Dean took a liking to Wayne. Like David, he could easily be groomed into committing crimes for him. Wayne, desperate to please his mentor, always did as he was told. On one occasion, Dean asked Wayne if he would have the courage to kill, and Wayne said yes. In late 1971, The trio met with each other at Dean's house. Sometime during the visit, Dean told Wayne that he was part of a sex trafficking ring that operated from Dallas. He offered to pay Wayne hundreds of dollars for any boy that he could procure for him. The prospect of being a sex trafficker pushed Wayne's moral limits a little too far, and he declined Dean's proposal. He wasn't even sure if he was being serious. There were a lot of young people in Dean's company, though, and he was reminded of all the teens who had gone missing in the past year. A sinking feeling came over as he wondered if Dean was behind it all. On September 25th, 1970, Dean was driving around Houston's west side when he came upon a young hitchhiker standing on a busy street corner. The hitchhiker was 18-year-old Jeffrey Conan, a University of Austin student who was returning to his home in Houston. It's unknown what switched in Dean's mind, but it appears he saw this moment as an opportunity. Dean beckoned Jeffrey into his car. Instead of going to Jeffrey's home, Dean drove to his apartment on Yorktown Street, where he forced the young man inside. Jeffrey was then bound, gagged, raped, and strangled. Dean then covered the body of Jeffrey with lime, wrapped him in plastic, and drove to High Island Beach, where he buried the body under a boulder. Perhaps Dean realized that it would only be a matter of time before someone discovered Jeffrey's body on the beach, so any future victims would have to be hidden somewhere more secure. In November of 1970, he began renting a boat shed on Silver Bell Street in Pasadena to serve as his very own cemetery. Confident after getting away with one kill, Dean fantasized about how he could commit more. He purchased an 8x3 plywood board and drilled 8 holes in it. Through these holes, he fastened handcuffs and ropes designed to thoroughly restrain and expose his victims. On December 13, 1970, two 14-year-olds named James Glass and Danny Yates were lured to Dean's apartment. Glass had previously visited Dean's place and assumed that he and Danny were headed to a party there. While there, Dean restrained the two, tied them to his torture board, and began raping them. In the midst of the assault, David entered the room. Startled by his unexpected visit to the apartment, Dean told David to keep his mouth shut. He finished assaulting the two, then strangled them. David didn't know how to process what he'd just seen, but he did as Dean told and didn't tell anyone. Sometime later, Dean presented David with a gift. It was a green 1969 Chevrolet Corvette, a reward for his silence. Dean saw David as a potential accomplice to his depraved crimes. He told David that instead of giving him money for free, he would have to work for it. That work would involve bringing Dean more boys, each worth $200. David accepted the offer. Dean took the two bodies to the boat shed. He dug a large hole in the southwest corner and buried James and Danny together, then filled it over. An electrical cord with clips was also buried in the hole. God knows what Dean did with it. Based on David's later confessions, it's possible that 2 further unidentified victims were killed in 1970. More info on this later. By late January, Dean had moved into an apartment on Mangum Road. You're going to notice that from this point on, Dean will move houses often. It's possible that this is something Dean did as a means of throwing police off his trail. On January 30th, 1971, a month after the murders of James and Danny, David and Dean encountered 2 potential victims, brothers Donald and Jerry Waldrop, 15 and 13 respectively. They were walking home from a friend's house when Dean pulled up next to them in his Ford Econoline. He suggested the 4 hang out at his place for a little while, so Donald and Jerry hopped into his van. The two suffered the same fate as Dean's previous two victims. They were taken to Dean's apartment, tied to his torture board, raped repeatedly, and strangled. According to David, Everett Waldrop, the father of the two boys, was doing repair work on the house next door to Dean's. Unbeknownst to him, his boys were being tortured and killed mere feet away from him. In the coming days, Everett was obviously extremely concerned over the disappearances of his children. He reported them as missing and would contact Houston police asking for updates regarding their disappearances. Unfortunately, the police would often dismiss the case. In one of his frequent visits to the police station, Everett was told by an officer, "Why are you down here? You know your boys are runaways." This refusal to investigate the missing person cases as anything other than runaways is a large part of why Dean would continue to get away with murdering these boys. Dean dug a large hole in the southeast corner of the boat shed. He dumped Jerry in first, then Donald, and covered it over. These suspicious activities caught the attention of an acquaintance of Everett, who subsequently contacted police. Officers arrived later and searched the perimeter of the boat shed, and predictably found nothing. On March 9, 1971, 15-year-old Randall Harvey completed his shift at a gas station and rode his bicycle home. On his way home, Dean and David pulled up and offered him a ride. Randall got in and was driven to Mangum Road, where he was abused by Dean. Unlike the other victims, Randall was shot in the head as opposed to being strangled. On May 29, 1971, David and Dean killed an additional 2 people. This time, the victims were 13-year-old David Hillegeist and 16-year-old Gregory Winkle. Gregory was a former employee of the Corll Candy Company and thus knew Dean well. David, on the other hand, hardly knew him at all, but nonetheless was convinced to visit Dean's apartment. They were both killed that afternoon. About 3 months later, on August 17th, a 17-year-old friend of David Brooks named Reuben Haney was lured from a movie theater to Dean's apartment on the promise of attending a party. Of course, there was no party, and Reuben was instead killed, becoming the duo's 9th victim. By now, the community in Houston Heights was beginning to notice that something was seriously wrong. It was a relatively tight-knit community, and everyone seemed to know someone who had gone missing. While Dean and David continued to get away with their awful crimes, it was later revealed that there was some suspicion on them. Shortly after the disappearance of Randall Harvey, the police received an anonymous tip from someone who believed David Brooks was connected to the case. Unfortunately, it seems this tip fell on deaf ears. Dean continued to fill the boat shed. Randall Harvey was buried near James Glass and Danny Yates. David Hillegeist and Gregory Winkle were buried together in a hole just north of him. Realizing he was running out of space in the back, Dean dug a hole toward the entrance of the shed where he buried Reuben Haney. Wayne convinced himself that, if what Dean said was indeed true, he would never become involved with his so-called slavery ring. But by early 1972, the Henley family was in dire circumstances. Money disappeared from their hands at a rapid pace, and soon it would be a struggle to make ends meet. Dean's promise of money was alluring. Whether Wayne was legitimately groomed by Dean into committing horrendous acts, or if he himself was as psychopathic as Dean, is uncertain. But Wayne decided to take him up on his offer, becoming Dean's second henchman. His assignment was simple: find another boy around his age and bring him to Dean. The name and date of Wayne's first victim is unknown, but they were likely abducted in February of 1972. Dean and Wayne cruised around the heights in search of a victim. They managed to find a suitable candidate on a street corner and offered to let them smoke marijuana at Dean's house. The youth accepted and was brought to Dean's home on Schuler Street, which he had moved into earlier that month. Here, the three smoked as promised. Sometime during the visit, Wayne offered to show the victim a magic trick that Dean had taught him. Wayne put handcuffs on himself, then snuck a key out of his back pocket and used it to unlock the cuffs, pretending as if he had magically wriggled his hands free. Wayne told the victim to try the trick themselves. He put the handcuffs on, and Dean suddenly lunged at the boy, taping his mouth shut and tying his feet. Wayne's work here was finished, and he was free to leave. Wayne believed that the victim was now part of a national sex slavery ring, but it's more likely they suffered a different fate at the mercy of Dean. Warning: I'm about to describe some of the torture that Dean inflicted on his victims. If you do not want to hear this, skip to the 23 minutes and 33 seconds mark. Most of Dean's victims were killed on the day of their abduction. After restraining the victim, they would be placed on his torture board and spread-eagled. If he had two victims, they would be tied and cuffed on opposite ends of the board. In order to muffle their screams, he stuffed gags into their mouths and secured them with duct tape. From here, the victims would be sodomized and assaulted in numerous ways. The depravity of Dean's methods increased over time. Victims would often have their pubic hairs individually plucked out, and Dean would begin gnawing and biting their genitals. He would beat his victims, sometimes to the point of breaking their bones. Dean would shove large objects into their rectums. Perhaps the worst torture that Dean's victims had to endure involved glass rods. Dean would insert these rods into the victim's urethra, then shatter them while they were still in there. There is evidence to suggest that Dean also attempted to electrocute some of his victims. At least one victim had their genitals completely severed and placed in a bag. I can only hope this occurred after the victim was dead. Some of the scenes were apparently so grisly that Dean had to cover the floor in plastic sheets to prevent blood from staining the carpets. After Dean was finished, which could be anywhere from a few hours to a few days after the torture began, he would strangle his victims with a rope or shoot them in the head with a .22 caliber pistol. After covering their bodies with lime and wrapping them in plastic, he would stuff them into wooden boxes and transport them to their burial locations. On March 24, 1972, 18-year-old Frank Aguirre finished the night shift at a Long John Silver's. Upon leaving the restaurant, he was spotted by David, Dean, and Wayne, who encouraged him to hang out with them at Dean's place. Frank agreed, and the four went to the apartment. They hung out for a while, drinking beer and smoking pot. At some point, Dean lunged at Frank and handcuffed him, and David assisted Dean in gagging him and putting him on the board. Wayne was shocked by what he was seeing and didn't intend to lure Frank in as a victim. He tried to convince Dean not to sell Frank into sex slavery, to which Dean informed Wayne that there was no sex ring and that Frank was going to be killed. It suddenly occurred to Wayne that Dean was the one who killed his friend, David Hillegeist, and he had done the same with every other boy he abducted. Frank was strangled that night. Together, the three had now killed at least 11 people. Despite the horrendous nature of these crimes, David and Wayne were now thoroughly under Dean's control and became as twisted and murderous as he was. Instead of burying Frank in the boat shed, the three drove to High Island Beach and buried him there. Frank had driven himself to Dean's apartment, so the trio had to get rid of his 1967 Rambler somehow. According to Wayne, they elected to dismantle the whole thing and either sold or disposed of the parts. A month later, the trio abducted another victim. 17-year-old Mark Scott was lured to Dean's apartment. As Dean made his move and attempted to restrain Mark, he managed to break free and grabbed a knife, swiping at Dean. Wayne then brandished Dean's pistol and pointed it at Mark. Realizing the futility of his situation, Mark dropped the knife and surrendered. That night, he was tortured, and the next morning, he was strangled and buried at the beach. Over the coming week, Mark Scott's family frantically searched for him, going around town to various diners and hangout spots to see if he was there. They called his friends, local hospitals, and of course, the police. No updates came until a few days after April 20th, when something arrived in the mail. It was a letter from Mark that read, "How are you doing? I am in Austin for a couple days. I found a good job. I am making $3 an hour." The letter was indeed written by Mark, but under the duress of Dean. It was a sick tactic that he would employ in some of his later murders. The Scott family were skeptical of the letter's authenticity. It was unlike Mark to just up and disappear for a job opportunity. Their concerns remained, and they patiently awaited his return, though he would never come back. 1 month later, on May 21st, the three committed the double murders of 16-year-old Johnny DeLome and another former Corll Candy Company employee, 17-year-old Billy Balk Jr. They suffered torture and rape at the hands of Dean, then were killed. Billy went first and was strangled by Wayne. Johnny went next and was shot in the forehead, but managed to survive. Wayne then strangled him too. 3 days later, Billy Balk's family received a letter from Madisonville, Texas that read, "Dear Mom and Dad, I am sorry to do this, but Johnny and I found a better job working for a trucker loading and unloading from Houston to Washington, and will be back in 3 to 4 weeks. After a week, I will send some money to help you and Mom out. Love, Billy." By the time the Balk family read this letter, Billy and Johnny were already buried at High Island Beach. Around this time, the trio nearly killed another victim. 19-year-old William Reidinger and his family had known the Corlls since the early 60s. He was lured to Dean's apartment on some pretense, and, like the other victims, he was restrained on the board and was tortured by Dean. But at some point during the encounter, David managed to convince Dean to let William go. Though he had previously denied such a request in the case of Frank Aguirre, Dean decided to grant David's wish. He was confident that William would keep his mouth shut, and he was let go. It's unknown what Dean told Billy after releasing him, but it succeeded in keeping him quiet. Had Billy gone to the police, he could have saved at least 14 lives. Perhaps in retaliation for letting William go, Dean later restrained David to the torture board and abused him. Despite this, David and Dean would somehow remain on good terms. No known victims were killed in June. It was during this month that Dean moved from Schuler Street to an apartment complex called the Westcott Towers. As he finished getting settled, he continued his murder spree. It appears neither David nor Wayne were involved in the next two killings. Late into the night on July 19th, 17-year-old Stephen Sickman was leaving a party at a friend's house. While returning home, Dean lured him to his Westcott apartment, where he was tortured and severely beaten. On the morning of the 20th, Stephen was strangled and his body was wrapped up. Approximately a month later, 19-year-old Roy Bunton was abducted by Dean while walking to his job at a shoe store. After his abuse, he was shot twice on the head and wrapped up. Following a period of burying his victims at the beach, Dean decided to return to the boat shed. He dug a hole in the northwest corner and threw Stephen and Roy's cadavers inside. In the fall of 1972, Dean re-enlisted the help of David and Wayne. On October 2nd, the two accomplices cruised around the heights in David's Corvette. They discovered 13-year-old Richard Hembry and 14-year-old Wally Simino walking down the street. Wayne and David picked them up and drove to Westcott Towers, where Dean tortured them. Apparently, at some point during the encounter, Wally managed to get a hold of his mother over Dean's phone. He was able to yell, "Mama!" before someone hung it up. The next morning, Richard and Wally were strangled. The following month, between November 12th and 19th, 19-year-old Richard Kepner, who was among Dean's older victims, was abducted while walking to a payphone. He was tortured and strangled that night. One more victim was killed in 1972. It was an acquaintance of David and Wayne's named Willard Branch Jr., the son of a Houston PD officer. He was lured to Dean's house, where he was tortured and killed. There are differing accounts as to when exactly Willard was murdered. More info on this later. Richard Kepner was Dean's sixth victim to be buried at High Island Beach. The other three Westcott Towers victims killed by the trio, Richard Hembry, Wally Simoneau, and Willard Branch, were buried in the shed. Dean opened up the graves of James Glass and Danny Yates and dumped Richard and Wally on top of them. Willard was buried in a new grave near Roy Bunton. By now, most of the bodies in the shed would have been rotting pretty severely, and I'm wondering how Dean even managed to stomach the smell. This might be why, over the coming year, Dean would utilize the boat shed less and less in favor of more remote locations. In January of 1973, Dean moved out of Westcott Towers and into an apartment complex off of Wirt Road. He killed only once at this address, and it occurred shortly after he moved in. On February 1st, 17-year-old Joseph Lyles, who lived down the street from David Brooks, was lured to Dean's apartment. He was likely tortured and killed on the day of his abduction. Afterwards, Joseph was buried at a beach in Jefferson County. This was a somewhat unusual location, as all of Dean's other victims were either buried in the shed or at High Island Beach. Neither Wayne nor David knew that Joseph had been buried there, and his body would not be discovered for quite a long time. After Joseph Lyles, Dean did not kill anyone for 4 months straight. This apparent dormant period was likely the result of Dean being diagnosed with a hydrocele. A hydrocele is basically the accumulation of excess fluid within one's ballsack. Also during this time, Wayne had temporarily moved to Mount Pleasant, Texas, a town several hours north of Houston. Perhaps it was during this move and Dean's concurrent hiatus that Wayne's moral conscience began to seep back in. In the spring of 1973, he applied for the U.S. Navy, possibly in an effort to further distance himself from Dean. His application was declined that June due to the fact that he was a high school dropout. Wayne would later say in an interview, "I couldn't leave anyway. If I did go, I knew Dean would go after one of my little brothers, who he always liked a little too much." David Brooks also appeared to be trying to remove himself from Dean. After turning 18, he and his girlfriend Bridget became engaged and moved into an apartment a fair distance away from Dean. In March, Dean's father Arnold moved out of a home at 2020 Lamar Drive in Pasadena. He offered Dean the home, and he accepted, moving in that month. By now, Dean had moved 7 times in less than 3 years. This was the first place he owned outside of Houston. It was his first proper house as opposed to an apartment, and it would be his last address. Wayne and David inevitably found themselves in Dean's company again, and Dean had seemingly recovered from his hydrocele. He was becoming anxious. He was tortured by depraved sexual desires that he had not satisfied in months. The only way he could even keep them somewhat at bay was by constantly smoking cigarettes or getting high, but it wasn't enough. The trio rarely talked about the murders directly. They seemed to avoid conversation about the acts, and when it was brought up, they referred to it with euphemisms. But they didn't need to discuss future murders directly. Both David and Wayne could tell from a mile away when Dean was ready to kill again. On June 4th, 1973, 15-year-old William Lawrence was abducted by Dean and Wayne after leaving his home on 31st Street. At the Lamar Drive house, William was forced to make a call to his parents, stating that he would be gone for the next 3 days to go fishing with some friends. After this call, Dean proceeded to hold William in captivity for 3 days. On June 6, William, having endured 2 days of torture and abuse, was forced to write a letter to his parents. It read, "Dear Daddy, I have decided to go to Austin because I have got a good job offer. I am sorry that I decided to leave, but I just had to go. P.S. I will be back in late August. Hope you understand, but I had to go. Daddy, I hope you know I love you. Your son, Billy." The next day, William was strangled with a cord, wrapped in plastic, put in a box, and driven 2.5 hours northeast to Lake Sam Rayburn. Dean owned a cabin on the lake and would sometimes come here with David and Wayne. The heavily wooded areas around the lake would serve as their burial grounds for the next month. After burying William, they postmarked the letter to his parents and returned to Houston. The murders increased in frequency from here. In that same month, on June 15th, Dean abducted Raymond Blackburn, a 20-year-old from Baton Rouge who was in Houston for a construction job. Raymond was presumably strangled that night, and the trio took the body of Ray Blackburn to Sam Rayburn. Upon reaching their intended burial site, they discovered that William's body had been buried poorly, and it had literally floated to the surface after some heavy rain, with his hand exposed above ground. They reburied William, and they buried Raymond nearby. In July, Wayne met a 15-year-old named Homer Garcia at a driving school. The two quickly became acquainted, and on July 7th, Wayne convinced Homer to hang out with him at Dean's. At Lamar Drive, Homer was tortured and then thrown in Dean's bathtub, where he was shot and left to slowly bleed to death. Afterwards, he was buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. On July 19th, 15-year-old Michael Balk was lured to Dean's house. Looking at this photo, I can't help but wonder about the toll taken on Michael. He was the only remaining child of 3. His oldest brother, Marvin, died in a car crash in 1969. The second, Billy, had been killed by Dean the previous year, and now, the Balk family's youngest would become another victim. Michael was tortured, strangled, and was the last to be buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Just 6 days later, Dean and Wayne committed the double murders of 17-year-old Charles Corll and 18-year-old Marty Jones. It appears Dean forced Charles to make a call to his father in which he claimed he and Marty had been kidnapped by drug dealers. After this, the two were tied to opposite ends of his board, where Dean tortured them individually, forcing one to listen to the other's agony. Dean kept Charles and Marty alive for 2 days. On July 27th, he unshackled them and told them to fight to the death. Whoever killed the other would be allowed to leave the home. After several hours of fighting with no winner, Dean tied them back up and raped them. Charles was then shot twice in the head, and Wayne was tasked with strangling Marty with a cord. He failed in this effort and asked Dean to come in and help. Marty died with his mouth wide open, likely his last desperate attempt to take in air. 1 week later, on August 3rd, Dean and David met 13-year-old James Stanton Dramala while he was riding his bike near the Lamar Drive home. He was lured to Dean's house, where, after hanging out for nearly an hour, he was tied to the board, tortured, and killed. By now, nearly 3 years since the beginning of the killing spree, Dean Corll and his 2 accomplices had killed 27 known people, more than any other serial killer in US history up to that point. There's a couple more victims who I'll mention later. After this, Dean took to using the boat shed again. Between Willard Branch and Gregory Winkle, he dumped the bodies of Charles Corll and Marty Jones together. Over on the east side of the shed, he dug a hole and threw in the body of Stanton Dramala. At this point, Dean began asking the shed owners if he could start renting another unit. He was running out of room in his current one. David and Wayne were beginning to struggle with the knowledge that their killing spree had caused so much pain and grief for countless people in Houston Heights, though they felt, for some inexplicable reason, that they could not pull themselves away from Dean once and for all. And so, they began plotting to kill him, but they didn't know how they would gather the courage to do so. Wayne tried to confess to his mother the horrible deeds he and David had been carrying out, though his mother had a hard time believing it. He wrote an entire confession letter and instructed her to submit it to the police in the event he went missing. David likely hoped that he could up and leave his past via his relationship with Bridget. He married her in July 1973, and the couple were expecting a child that December. Meanwhile, Dean was becoming suicidal. The day after Stanton Dramala's murder, he called his mother, Mary, in Colorado and told her that he was considering overdosing. When asked why, he refused to elaborate. The next day, Mary called Dean again, and he claimed he was, quote, dodging someone, and that he needed to get out of Houston as soon as he could. Perhaps Dean was planning to move elsewhere and continue his murders in a new location, but before he did this, he would attempt one more murder in Houston Heights. On August 7, 1973, Dean held another late-night party at the Lamar Drive home, asking Wayne to bring him another victim. The person he chose was 19-year-old Timothy Corll. Dean, Wayne, and Tim hung out for several hours, drinking beer and huffing paint. Around midnight, Wayne and Tim left the house for a little while to retrieve something. The two drove to Houston Heights and parked on 27th Street. As Wayne approached his house, he heard yelling coming from across the street. It emanated from the home of his girlfriend, Rhonda Williams, a 15-year-old who was previously in a relationship with Frank Aguirre before he disappeared. Rhonda had just got beaten by her abusive father, and Wayne offered to take her to Dean's so that she could get out of the house for the night. At around 3 in the morning, the trio arrived at Dean's house. Upon entering, Dean was shocked to see that Wayne had brought Rhonda, a girl, to his home. He took Wayne to another room and scolded him, saying he ruined the night. After some talking, Wayne managed to calm him down and the party continued. Dean plied the trio with alcohol, and after some time, Rhonda, Tim, and Wayne blacked out. Upon waking, Wayne found that Dean had handcuffed him and tied up Rhonda and Tim. Dean explained that he was going to kill all three of them that morning. He planned to rape and kill Tim first, then execute Rhonda and Wayne. Wayne tried to calm him down. He told Dean to spare his life on the agreement that he would assist him in killing his two friends. It took a while to convince him, but eventually, Dean uncuffed Wayne and handed him a knife. All four were taken into Dean's bedroom, where Rhonda and Tim were tied to his bed, and Dean instructed Wayne to assault Rhonda while he assaulted Tim. The two victims suddenly awoke and, in a fit of confusion and terror, began begging for their lives. As Dean moved in to assault Tim, Wayne began to panic. Suddenly, in a moment of clarity, he grabbed the .22 caliber pistol and pointed it at Dean. Wayne yelled, "I can't go on any longer. I can't have you kill all my friends." Dean then slowly moved towards him, daring him to shoot, testing to see if he had the balls to do so. In the words of Rhonda, Wayne killed the devil. He returned to the bedroom and released Rhonda and Tim. In the following minutes, the three discussed what their next move should be. Wayne wondered if it would be possible to hide Dean's body, or to simply leave the crime scene without leaving a trace of their presence. Tim, however, suggested that they call the police. police arrived at 2020 Lamar Drive around 8:30 a.m. Wayne informed them that he had committed a homicide within the home, and they discovered Dean's body in the hallway, as well as the pistol, the torture board, the wooden crates, handcuffs, dildos, glass rods, a mask full of nitrite poppers, and the Econoline van, which was outfitted with more torture implements. Wayne, Tim, and Rhonda were taken to the police station. Wayne told police he killed Dean in self-defense. This the police believed. What they had a harder time believing was what Wayne told them next. He stated that over the past 3 years, he and a friend named David Brooks had been supplying a man named Dean Corll with over 24 boys that he would systematically rape, torture, kill, and bury. To corroborate this claim, Wayne offered to take the police to the boat shed. That afternoon, the police opened up stall number 11. In their company was Wayne, who directed the search, and 2 prison trustees armed with shovels. Inside the shed were various items. Of note were bags of lime, bags of victims' clothing, a stripped-out car, and Stanton Dramala's bike. Wayne directed the trustees to the east side of the shed, and they began digging. There, they uncovered the body of the most recent victim, Stanton Dramala. That evening, they discovered the bodies of the following victims in order: Roy Bunton, Marty Jones, Charles Cobble, Wally Simino, Randall Harvey, James Glass, and Danny Yates. As the sun fell and the clock inched towards midnight, the search was adjourned. By now, the news media had descended on the scene.
Officers from several Houston area police agencies converged on a boat storage shed and began opening the shallow graves. They were led to the site by 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. During the grave digging operations, Henley called his mother and told her the story on a mobile telephone.
Who?
Mama,
Who's this?
it's Wayne.
Yes, this is Mama, baby.
Mama,
Huh?
I killed Dean.
Wayne?
Ma'am?
What are you doing?
Yes.
Oh, God. Where are you?
Out at that warehouse he keeps.
Can I come out there?
No, you can't come. I'm with the police, Mama.
The next day, on August 9th, the digging continued. This day's search yielded the bodies of David Hillegeist, Gregory Winkle, Richard Hembry, Willard Branch, Donald Waldrop, Jerry Waldrop, Stephen Sickman, and Reuben Haney. Towards the front of the shed, the investigators uncovered another body. Despite the subsequent efforts to identify this decedent, they remain unidentified to this day. In total, 17 bodies had been buried in the boat shed. Wayne insisted that there were more to be found, and that evening, the police drove north to Lake Sam Rayburn to continue their search efforts. They searched Dean's lakeside cabin. Inside, they discovered more tools used in the burial of victims, as well as a second torture board, though apparently it's unknown if Dean ever used it. Going into the woods, Wayne directed the police to the general area where bodies were buried. Eventually, 2 were unearthed: William Lawrence and Raymond Blackburn. The search resumed the next day, August 10th, and the other 2 bodies were found: Homer Garcia and Michael Balk.
Well, how do you feel about this whole ordeal?
Pretty grotesque.
What do you mean by that?
You read the dictionary?
What?
I just haven't felt like I was going to be able to hold my sanity much longer.
What provoked you that night for you to decide to tell it all?
I just think I owe these people this much to let them know what's happened to their boys. Now, these just some boys that he picked up, or I helped him get, rather. And he raped them, ended up killing them, brought them down here and buried them.
What part did you play in that?
I helped him pick them.
What part did you play in any of the killing, or did you?
No comment.
Now, David Brooks is another person who has been named. Now, what role did he play in all of this?
Same as mine.
Meanwhile, David Brooks presented himself at the police station, gave a written confession, and joined the search, which now had moved to the third burial location, High Island Beach. Wayne had some difficulty recalling the exact burial locations, but there was one landmark that David was able to recognize, the boulder under which Jeffrey Conan had been buried. Jeffrey appears to be the only body that was recovered that day, and the search was adjourned for the weekend.
Let us get first. No. Come here, Wayne.
Eyewitness News correspondent Larry Connors has covered the story since that first night.
David, this entire story of sadistic homosexual slayings would almost appear to be fiction, scripted with the full intention of shocking readers over and over again. A deadly conspiracy now listed as one of the most horrifying crimes in this century. An innocent-looking Pasadena home, but some of the people who went in were carried out in plastic bags. They had been murdered. Death in most cases came after the victims had been subjected to various sex acts and torture. The victims were all boys in the early to mid-teens who allegedly had been lured into a death trap by this young man, 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley. Yesterday, the trail of graves took lawmen and newsmen to the southeast of Houston. Henley and Brooks said there were more bodies buried along the Gulf of Mexico. A Beaumont family out to spend a quiet day along the Gulf learned that they were within 10 feet of another victim. As the digging started and revealed the remains of still another body, the family packed up their camper.
I never said there were 30 people. I said 24. The name's Junior, not Elmer Wayne Henley.
Well, what?
Get your pictures.
Elmer Wayne Henley, Jr., a young man who says now that he can sleep and live since this nightmare is out in the open. David.
On Monday, August 13th, the search at High Island resumed. By now, the case had become something of a media spectacle, and a crowd of spectators gathered around the search party.
Digging started here early this afternoon. Searchers are confronted with a toll of victims that seems to grow every hour, and they have no idea when it will stop growing.
On this day, David and Wayne led police to the bodies of Billy Balk, Frank Aguirre, Johnny DeLome, and Richard Kepner. In the process, a sixth body was recovered from the beach. The decedent had been shot 4 times and was buried fully clothed. The body was later identified as 17-year-old John Sellers, who had disappeared on July 12th of that year. Due to the somewhat unusual nature of his death and burial, and the fact that neither David nor Wayne seemed to recognize him, the investigators felt that John might have been the victim of a completely separate, unsolved killing. After these last bodies were recovered from High Island, the search was terminated. Wayne insisted that there were at least 2 more bodies to be found on the beach, those of Mark Scott and Joseph Lyles, but the investigation did not continue any further, and David and Wayne returned to their cells.
The total number killed in the largest recorded sex perversion and murder case in U.S. history now stands at 27. Authorities believe they may have recovered all of the bodies. 17-year-old Elmer Wayne Henley, who has been charged along with another youth with murder, is being kept in isolation in a Houston jail because of reported threats on his life by prisoners.
Do you believe your son did any of this?
No, sir. Wayne's not that kind of person. I don't know what, he's just a little 17-year-old boy that was close to his family, that's all I know.
What is your reaction now toward the Henleys that live just a block or so up the street?
I have no bitterness. I've known them all these years, and I have a lot of compassion for them. I realize that this even with our grief with our son possibly being dead and possibly him knowing about it, I can feel compassion for them because I feel that they're in a much tougher place right now than we are.
Today, the father of one of the dead boys showed up at police headquarters to ask David Brooks how his son died and if he suffered much pain.
But the mother of this boy, Henley, I know that she's going through probably the same things we are, and people shouldn't try to condemn the mother for what the son has done. No vengeance. Strictly let God do it. Let God take his own vengeance. These boys have a conscience they have to go through. These boys have to meet God someday.
Dean Corll's funeral took place in August. Mary West was in complete disbelief that her son had committed the murders, and mailed a letter to the media in which she asserted that David and Wayne must have been the actual masterminds of the killings. Meanwhile, the heart-wrenching process of informing the parents of their children's deaths began. Many of the funerals of Dean's victims did not occur for a while, as investigators were still working on identifying most of the bodies. The police were heavily criticized for not investigating the unusually high number of disappearances in the Heights earlier. As the bodies were hauled away, stall number 11 was emptied and the ground was refilled. The proceedings for David and Wayne commenced. David was charged with 4 murders and Wayne with 6. He was not charged in the death of Dean, as the court determined he killed him in self-defense. Wayne's trial went first and began on July 1st, 1974. Because the case had gained such notoriety in Houston, Wayne's trial was moved to San Antonio in February of that year, so as to hopefully provide him a fairer verdict. Many people traveled to the city to watch the trial unfold. His lawyers decided to play the insanity defense. 32 witnesses were called. These included Rhonda Williams, Tim Curley, and Billy Ridinger, who was shuffled into court with a paper bag on his head. The prosecutors described in detail how the victims were tortured and killed, details so horrendous that many attendees had to leave the courtroom temporarily. After 2 weeks, the trial concluded on July 15th. Wayne was found guilty of all 6 murders, and on the anniversary of Dean's death, he was sentenced to 6 consecutive 99-year sentences, which he would serve at the Texas State Penitentiary in Huntsville. David Brooks went next. His trial began on February 27, 1975, and took place in Houston, where he was accompanied by his wife, Bridget. Although he was initially charged with 4 murders, the only one for which he went on trial was William Lawrence. David's trial received far less coverage than Wayne's and lasted just a week. On March 4th, David was found guilty and received life in prison. He later appealed this sentence in 1979, but was rejected. Wayne also appealed his sentence, and in his case, he was granted a new trial. It began on June 18, 1979, and this time it took place in Corpus Christi, Texas. Wayne was 23 now, and Dean Corll was no longer the most prolific serial killer in U.S. history.
Well, I just hope we get a fair trial and are able to bring out our side of it this time. Which is to prove Wayne's innocence.
The 9-day trial concluded with the same verdict as before. Wayne was guilty on all 6 counts. David Brooks lived a quiet life in prison. He gave no interviews, and he never spoke of Dean Corll again. Wayne Henley was a bit different.
Are you guilty of killing anyone at all?
Am I guilty of killing anyone at all? No, I'm not.
How would you describe yourself?
Quiet, friendly, I work hard. I'm really not any different than anybody else.
Except that Elmer Wayne Henley is a serial killer. A serial killer who says he's reformed.
If a junkie can quit being a junkie, why can't I quit being what I was?
18 years ago, police were called to this house in a suburb of Houston on what they thought was a routine homicide. What they found was the bullet-ridden body of Dean Corll and a crying 17-year-old named Elmer Wayne Henley.
Instead of picked to be killed, I was picked to be a handyman.
You make it out to be you're a victim of a serial killer, but if you look at the record, you're a serial killer.
I'm not.
You're not a serial killer?
I'm not a serial killer.
You're saying you're not a serial killer now, but yet you've serially killed.
Oh, well, yeah, that's semantics. Without Corll, there wasn't a crime. On my own, there would have been no crime. It's not me. I'm passive.
Beyond these interviews, there's been a bunch of tabloid-esque news reports about Wayne and his various activities over the years, which I'm not really interested in covering. In May of 2020, David Owen Brooks contracted COVID-19. He was transferred to a hospital in Galveston, Texas, where he died on May 28th at the age of 65. Elmer Wayne Henley is still alive in prison, though recent reports indicate he is in failing health. In August of 2022, he applied for compassionate release from prison, but was denied. Are David and Wayne really guilty? Yes, they are. You can make the argument that they were under the influence of Dean, but they knew that what they were doing was wrong. David tried to ignore this fact for as long as he could. Wayne did the same until his own life was in danger. While researching this case, I was surprised at just how much information there was, but oftentimes it was difficult to find this info as it was scattered around the internet in forums, blog posts, and old newspapers. Much of this information seems to originate from an out-of-print book from 1974 called The Man with the Candy by Jack Olson. It's quite surprising how quickly Dean Corll was forgotten. The case received widespread news coverage at the time, so much so that it caught the attention of the Vatican as well as writer Truman Capote of In Cold Blood fame. He considered writing a book about it, but was unable to after apparently falling ill. The long and tedious process of identifying Dean's victims continues to this day. Joseph Lyle's remains were discovered on the Gulf Coast in 1983. His body wasn't identified until 2009 thanks to DNA. Richard Kepner was identified in 1983, Willard Branch in 1985. The 15th body uncovered in the shed was identified in 1993 as Mark Scott. But, if you recall, Mark had been buried at the beach, not the shed. In 2011, this body was correctly identified as Stephen Sickman. Mark Scott's body, unfortunately, has never been found. Randall Harvey was identified in 2008. One body unearthed from the shed remained unidentified until 2010 when it was confirmed to be Michael Balk. However, a different body had previously been misidentified as Michael. In 2011, that body was confirmed to be Roy Bunton. Body number 16 is the only one that remains unidentified to this day. Based on the decomposition and the fact that they were found with swimming trunks, they were likely killed around the summer of 1971. One of the people investigating this mystery is Dr. Sharon Derrick, who received an anonymous tip once claiming that the body was that of a teenager named Bobby French, but this tip has not been confirmed and it remains an open case. After Dean killed his first victim, Jeffrey Conan, his next two known victims were James Glass and Danny Yates. However, it is believed by some that two other unknown victims were killed between September and December of 1970. This fact comes from a disagreement among sources over who lured James and Danny to Dean's apartment. Some claim David Brooks lured them after he witnessed Dean murder two other boys, while others claim that Dean lured them and David stumbled in on the assault. If the former is true, then there are indeed 2 additional unknown victims to Dean's name. However, most sources agree that the latter is true, that the only people killed in 1970 were Jeffrey, James, and Danny. You might be wondering who the February 1972 victim was. Their identity is not conclusively known, but I would agree with those who think it was Willard Branch Jr. According to the medical examiner's office for Harris County, Willard was killed in November of 1972. However, many other sources, including Branch's own sister, say he was killed on February 9th, 1972, about the time that Wayne was first tasked with fetching Dean a victim. The only problem with this is that Wayne claimed his first victim was killed at 925 Schuler Street, which Dean moved into 10 days after Willard went missing. It's possible that this is mere misremembering on Wayne's part and misreporting on the medical examiner's part. If both of these are true, then I am confident that Wayne's first victim was Willard Branch. You may have seen this image before. A filmmaker found it among Wayne Henley's old possessions, and it has been speculated that the person in the photo is one of Dean's unknown victims. In my humble opinion, it is probably nothing. In 2021, an organization called Texas EquiSearch decided to investigate the possibility that Dean had buried more victims in the backyard of 2020 Lamar Drive. The digging lasted several days, but ultimately no remains were found. The contemporary reporting of the murders has a few interesting things of note. For starters, many newspapers repeated the incorrect name of Dean Allen Corll when his actual name was Dean Arnold Corll. I'm curious as to how this error originated. Second, it's interesting how the murders were characterized. One of the most common names for this serial killing spree is the Houston mass murders. Nowadays, the term mass murder generally refers to things like shootings or bombings, but in the early 70s, the term serial killer did not exist, and the news would group Dean in the same camp as legitimate mass killers like Charles Whitman. Many news outlets placed an emphasis on the homosexual aspect of the killings.
Sadistic homosexual slayings.
A kind of reporting that many people now would consider homophobic in nature. You'll also notice that a disproportionate amount of the news coverage focuses on Wayne, mainly because he's the one who confessed first and agreed to the most interviews.